talked about how did Napoleon, or the other day we talked about how Napoleon rose to power. Today we're going to talk about how did Napoleon try to spread his revolution across Europe. So the first question is, how would France be ruled by Napoleon was at war? Because a great deal of his time was spent fighting wars. So he wasn't necessarily always in France to govern. So basically, as he was conquering other areas, he carried outside of France the Napoleonic Code. That was the most influential modern legal system. And some states even keep the Napoleonic Code even after Napoleon is no longer around. But since he was commonly away at war, he set up basically a police a police state in France. And he ruled basically using a spy network. People who were suspected of any type of subversive activities were arbitrarily detained, placed under house arrest, or sent in some instances to insane asylums. So again, very authoritarian. Remember, I said the other day, he was censoring the press. He was reading people's mail. Everything had to be approved by him if it was going to be published in France. He devoted most of his time to war, though. He basically fights a permanent war for about 15 years. His major strength was him as a military man. But like I said, while he was off fighting these wars, he essentially is leaving a police state behind back in France. So why was Napoleon such an effective general, though? Because that's really what he's known for. So after he comes to power, he does try to make some overtures to what was called the Second Coalition, which was the alliance kind of against him, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia. And those overtures were rejected. His armies are occupying Madrid, Rome, Vienna, Berlin, and at one point he actually also Moscow. So he required a standing army, and it required conscription. So people were being drafted into the army, usually for about 5 years. By 1814, he had drafted 2.6 million men and led more than 1 million men to their death, which again, if you remember what I was talking about this with World War I, like armies were usually about like 600,000 men. So to have lost that many men and to have had drafted that many men, the numbers are huge, especially for the 19th century. And the reason why he would have such victories is because he would send huge numbers of men into battle, hundreds of thousands, 100,000 men or more into battle against an army of maybe 10,000 men. So he won battles because he had the largest army and he could maneuver it very well. And he was very ruthless when he had the advantage in battle. So sometimes, generals would be willing, it'd almost be like a gentleman's agreement, and they'd be willing to, surrender or, not press against the other army. He was ruthless. He would press until the other side was forced to surrender, unconditionally. And it all starts to turn against him when he begins to lose numbers, because his strength was almost kind of like a precursor to the Blitzkrieg that Hitler does, where he just sends everything at the other side. You need to have the superior numbers in order to be able to keep that up. So as he began to lose numbers, he began to lose battles. He did, though, have very effective military strategies, though. So he would use rapid fire artillery. Most armies would conserve their artillery. Artillery was expensive. It was difficult to maneuver. You had to have specialized corps to be able to fire it. I'm talking about cannons and things. He would just, put a constant barrage of cannon fire, where like the typical convention was like shoot the cannon, wait, let the ground troops advance, shoot the cannon again. He would just be cannon fire, cannon fire, cannon fire. He would also use his elite cavalry as like shock infantry troops and just like send the cavalry charging towards the other side. So in 1805, the Third Coalition was formed against him. It was Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. And Napoleon knew that he was not going to be able to invade England. There had been lots of plans in the works of like possible invasions of England, but they all wound up being discarded. So he centered his campaigns on Central Europe. In less than 2 years of fighting, he pretty much had gained control of all of Central Europe. His only setback was that his naval fleet, had been destroyed off the coast of Spain in the Battle of Trafalgar against the British Navy, really making any plans for invading England impossible. So he had all these plans that had been discarded, but he had always held out hopes that he would be able to invade England. And he thought with a combined force of the Spanish Navy and the French Navy, he'd be able to do so. But in the Battle of Trafalgar, the British Navy, like destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleet, and that really kind of made it clear that he was never going to be able to invade England. But like again, his military strategy is what made him, so popular, and he was there with his troops. So that takes us to the next question. How did Napoleon create what he called his grand empire? So after his victories in Europe, Napoleon kind of saw himself as the emperor of all of Europe. So we can see from this map the areas that he directly controlled and the areas that became French satellites. Now, in December of 1805, he wins the Battle of Austerlitz. And this was a decisive battle against the Austrians and the Russians. Russia was forced to pull back. Austria had to accept large territorial gains, and this was a pretty significant victory. And this really scared Prussia. Prussia was very alarmed, and they began to mobilize their armies. And in October of 1806, Napoleon won some other major battles, one of them being at the Battle of Jena and the other one in Austerlitz, in which the Prussians were outnumbered 2-1. So again, you can see here his strategy of just overwhelming the other side with a massive amount of troops. And so Russia kind of joins in the war, but when France continued to win, Russia was wanting to make peace. And so in June of 1807, the Tsar and the Emperor negotiate on a raft anchored in the middle of a river. And basically Russia was forced to agree to pretty much the reorganization of all of Europe. Excuse me. So Napoleon is going to exploit his military victories. He's going to redraw the map, and he's going to abolish the Holy Roman Empire. So that finally brings an end to the Holy Roman Empire. And Napoleon referred to all of his new lands as the Grand Empire. These newly created countries he basically then gave to his friends and family members to rule, and some areas were directly annexed by France. So the areas in dark blue were directly annexed by France. The areas in lighter blue he gave to family and friends. So by 1810, most of Europe was under Napoleon's control. The only areas that really remained free were Portugal, Britain, Scandinavia, Russia, and like the Ottoman Empire, parts of the Balkans. Austria and Prussia were under numerous controls, and Austria is going to be linked to France because remember I said Napoleon divorces his wife Josephine, and he marries the Emperor of the Emperor of Austria, whose name was Francis. He marries his teenage daughter Maria Louisa. Oh my God, I'm sorry, Maria Louisa. The Austrians love Maria Antoinette, Maria Theresa, Maria Louisa. So that kind of links Austria and France together through marriage. So that takes us to this question. How does he actually control the lands that he winds up conquering? So the impact of this on the people were a lot. He basically, again, brought the Napoleonic Code to these new areas that he takes over. He abolishes feudal dues. He abolishes serfdom. And some peasants and middle class actually benefited from these reforms under Napoleon. But he was first and foremost the French emperor, and he needed to put France's prosperity and interest first. So in order to lighten the taxes on the French, but still being able to continue his policy of war, he levied very heavy taxes on the areas that he conquered, and he conscripted men from the areas that he conquered into his army. So even though he freed the serfs and he abolished feudal dues, a lot of people saw him as a conquering tyrant rather than an enlightened liberator, because now they're being forced to pay heavy taxes to the French and being forced to fight in Napoleon's wars. So as a result, a great deal of nationalism began to develop in response to this. So I don't have the question listed here, but the question basically is, how did the Europeans respond to Napoleon's rule? Now, this picture is Goya's The 5th of May, and this is reflective of a revolt in Spain, because the first revolt breaks out in Spain in 1808. And it's a coalition of Catholics, monarchists, and patriots who rebelled against attempts to make Spain a French satellite, because Napoleon tries to put his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, which doesn't go over too well with the Spanish people. And they waged a guerrilla war to resist French imperialism. And the British also get involved in aiding the Spanish resistance. And this becomes known as the Peninsula Wars because of the Iberian Peninsula where Spain is on. And it went on for about close to a decade. It was a pretty long-standing war where the nationalists and the British were trying to fight against the people who were supportive of Bonaparte. And you kind of see this in this image from Goya, which is supposed to elicit Spanish nationalism, because you see this figure here standing there in this like Christ-like pose, wearing white, prominently lit up, about to be fired, shot by a French firing squad. You can't see any of the faces of the French soldiers. It's kind of, dehumanize the French, but then give humanity and pity and grief to the crying Spanish who are about to be killed. So the next question. Oh, sorry, I missed the topic. Sorry. So in 1806, Napoleon issues something called the Berlin Decrees, and he ordered the cessation of commerce and communication with Britain. It becomes known as the Continental System because he got so angry that the British were aiding his enemies. He decides to basically place an embargo on Britain, knowing he can't invade Britain. Sorry that my dog's going crazy. The theory being then that he would go after Britain economically. And this failed, though, because Napoleon did not have enough cooperation from his conquered lands. They still wanted to trade with Britain. Britain was the only country that was industrialized in the world at this time. So there was all this illegal smuggling going back and forth between Britain and the rest of the countries. Plus, it doesn't really hurt Britain's economy because Britain can trade with the US, Britain can trade with a whole bunch of other countries. And it hurt the French people, the Continental System. So a lot of people were defying the Continental System because people wanted the cheap manufactured goods coming from England. So that takes us to this question, which is the last question. How did his empire fall apart after his invasion of Russia? So Tsar Alexander I of Russia refuses to follow the Continental System, and Napoleon decides that he's going to invade. So in June of 1812, we have the Grand Army of 600,000 men, which was one of the largest armies ever amassed, invaded. Now, this army, I should also mention, was almost entirely made up of non-French because he had conscripted so many non-French into the army. So this was a disaster. It is one of the bloodiest battles in this was something called the Battle of Borodino, in which 44,000 Russians were killed in one day. And this is where we see the Russians using their scorched earth policies, which we've talked about before with Russia, where they retreat and they draw you deeper and deeper and deeper into the country. And then they basically burn everything in their path and then wait for winter to come. And that's what the Russians did here. So basically, Moscow falls to Napoleon, and Napoleon figured that they would winter in Moscow and then continue on to fight. But what the Russians do as they retreat is they burn the city down. So now the French troops have this very long supply line, and winter's coming, and they don't really have any place to stay for safety during the winter. So they have to retreat. And what Napoleon didn't do here, which might have possibly helped him, he didn't use the revolution to his advantage. He didn't liberate the Russian serfs, hoping that they would aid them. He doesn't do that. So he retreats. And it's one of the greatest mistakes in military history. Basically, 370,000 French soldiers die. 200,000 of them are taken prisoner. And the rest that survived were basically, many of them, that died were victims of starvation and the Russian winter or disease. And this really was a huge turning point against Napoleon. Like I said, this was one of the greatest mistakes he had ever could have made. So this led to the collapse of his empire. So 1813 is seen as kind of the year for German nationalism. So the King of Prussia, Frederick William III, he joins with the Russians, and they urge all Germans to unite against Napoleon. And a new allied coalition is created, led by Austria and their foreign minister, a man by the name of Metternich, who we're going to talk about a lot when we talk about the Congress of Vienna. Austria gets into a war against France, and pretty much war in Central Europe involved massive amounts of armies, and it becomes a war of liberation against France because Napoleon is seen as this tyrant. And then in October of 1813, we have what's known as which is called the Battle of Leipzig, which is also sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Nations to the Germans. It was an Allied force of 365,000 men, and that was double the French force. This, by the way, was 10 times the size of armies that you would have seen in the 18th century. But Napoleon was completely beaten. The Allied armies began coming into France. They occupy Paris in March of 1814, and Napoleon is forced to abdicate the throne. So that takes us to this question, where we see the lifespan of Napoleon. Why was Napoleon unable to maintain his grand empire?